Kenya Legacy, week one's in the books. We're already starting to think about week two, but first let's backtrack. Let's remember the week that was. The week filled with some injuries, some over and under performances. Overall, actually, though, a lot more under than over. We definitely had some great night games, though, and we had a field that was so slippery people couldn't walk for the first half, but then we pulled it out in the end. Some middling games in between, and for our league, we had the top two scores of week one go after each other, and it came down to only a matter of points. So let's get to some quick NFL recap, and then we'll jump to week one scores. If I even have a chance of doing this week by week, this is probably the section I'm going to have to be the most economical time-wise with. So I'm going to go Goldilocks and the Three Bears porridge style and just give you three takes, one way too hot, one way too cold, and hopefully one that's just right. My too hot, and it's so hot of a take that I don't even fully believe it, but it is certainly a reaction to week one. Offenses, or at least quarterbacks, were really bad. Epically bad. We usually have a bit of a funny start to the season. We'll get to that a little bit later. But this particular year, we only had two quarterbacks throw over 300 yards in the first week. But even kind of scaling that backwards, we did have this rookie class that was supposed to be phenomenal. And Caleb Williams threw for under 100. Daniels didn't throw for much, but he did run. And Bo Nix just threw a ton, but all very short passes. Other than that, the other kind of mainstays or the other kind of reported rookies did not have a good one. But sticking with our quarterbacks, just kind of to put it in reference, 32 starting quarterbacks. The only one that got really knocked out was Jordan Love at the end of the game, and he did fine, especially yards-wise. He was okay. Aaron Rodgers did sit out the last drive, which would have gotten him a few more yards. But of the 32, 17 of them, so math majors, that's more than half, were under 200 yards. As an old Spanish teacher used to say, that's not bueno at all. Horrible starts to the year for most of the quarterback, which means in our cases, tight ends and wide receivers. So who did score? You're looking mostly running backs, and actually kickers had a phenomenal week. And that's what you really sign up for fantasy for, right? Is the kickers. 19 different 50-yard plus field goals were hit this week. And there was actually, that doesn't even include the one from Dallas's Aubrey, who he did technically tie league record 66-yard field goal, but it was called back due to a penalty, and they didn't have the guts to kick a 71, because even against the Browns, I guess they felt that was too much. So who knows if this is offenses that are going to stick around, but certainly not one that we get off to. Two teams actually won, Bears and Steelers, without scoring an offensive touchdown. So week two, here's hoping the scores are a little bit higher. My too cold of a take, because it's not even really a take, but it's certainly something I noticed. NFL's awesome at scheduling games, pretty much. Now, number one, this is the first time I've ever been a fan of night games, because I'm actually in a place when you wake up in the morning and the night games are happening. It's actually quite nice. But the night games were all the rivalry ones that we pretty much probably wanted to see. You got the return matchups with Kansas City and Baltimore, even to an extent an NFC power matchup in Brazil with Green Bay and Philadelphia. But you've got the Goff-Stafford wife swap or quarterback swap. I know you got to be careful, especially with Stafford involved. But that game where they not only a redo of last year's playoff run, but also they both have experiences with both teams. So that rivalry game was great. Not a night game, but the Arthur Smith revenge matchup, Pittsburgh and Atlanta. So they did really match up those games to make them a little more competitive. But even on the weaker side, I read something that almost 2/3 of elimination pools were pretty much done, or at least 2/3 of people were out because they took Cincinnati to beat New England. And they shocked everything. New England probably could have only beaten 3 teams so far this year in week one, and they picked one of them, the NFL, to make that a game. So now we have to think, are they a decent team? Tampa Bay and New Orleans looked great, but that's because Carolina and Washington probably didn't. But now we have to think, are they good, or is the other team just really that bad? So ultimately, if you can make me care about games that I really shouldn't care about, well done, NFL. You did a good job. For my just right, and this is my take pretty much every year, back when I used to live in a city where you actually could throw a little bit of money down on the first, on the actual matchups of the game or the results of the games, point spread or not. The first 4 to 5 weeks are actually really fun because the NFL odds makers haven't caught up to who's really good and really bad, and we're really going on kind of last year's records and the predictions coming in. But you can always bank on week one being just crazy. Thinking about it already. Number one, the best or the most coveted fantasy football player didn't even play in the Monday night game, and apparently The 49ers knew this for a while, and they just decided to keep this one to themselves. In many people's board, the number one wide receiver, and in some cases the number 2 pick overall, was arrested on his way to the game. No jokes there, not really that funny, except for he exploded and had an amazing game afterwards after saying to the officer, apparently, that he actually did want to be a cop at some day. So odd experience there, but that's just week 1, I guess. Denver had 2 safeties in the first half. You had a kickoff return, punt returns, pick sixes, unorthodox ways of teams winning. There was 4 12 or more point deficits that were made. Actually, I think 14 or more point deficit games that the comebacks kind of came about in the fourth quarter. So really nothing was stable. And even probably one of my favorite little pieces in the Brazil game, if you watched the entire first half, people were falling all over the place. Apparently they couldn't get their grips. Now, the U.S. is funny. It can't really sort out a lot of political issues, but at halftime, it could certainly sort out cleats, and everybody was running fine afterwards. But I think my funniest piece is knowing some of the audience and maybe the amount of Americans who probably haven't been to Brazil. Just think now of the percentage of Americans who honestly think, because they saw it, that the entire country of Brazil is just super slippery and you're going to fall everywhere. Huge matchups, great performances, and certainly some duds. But to get to the specifics of players, we're going to take a pause and we'll jump into this week's matchups. In what turned out to be the craziest matchup, and I do fully understand talking about myself first is uncouth, but come on, the top 2 scorers played each other and the differential came down to about 3 points. This was a pretty epic matchup, and I'm actually 90% of the time I thought I was losing this one, so I'm actually pretty pumped about this. Sorry, Connor, this stinks because you wouldn't have beaten anyone else this week by over 20, but for you, Allen was a QB1. You knew he was a stud. Now, you didn't quite get the performance you thought out of your run or your quarterback 2, but you can't be mad about Mixon. I was totally wrong about him. He's come out of the gates flying. He was our running back 2 on the week. After that, you didn't have anyone crack in the top 5 necessarily, but you certainly had a lot of points, double digits in most categories that counted. You're going to hear a lot this week about that tight end didn't perform well because tight ends sucked this week. In fact, you're going to even notice our top 5. Njoku only scored 8, and he is just out of the top 5. He is not that far out, folks. But getting 22 from Kamara, 20 from Collins, these are all things that are going to win you 90% of your weeks, so you got to be pretty bummed. Speaking of tight ends that just kick you where it doesn't count, Pitts would have actually gotten you the win. He was our tight end 4, so that kind of stinks. But I hate doing that because we can go through and say, if you woulda, coulda, it is what it is. You made some right calls. Now, I'm going to be dealing with some injuries next week, but that's future me's problem. For present me, I was pretty happy that Kupp was the wide receiver 2. And then similarly, I didn't have anyone else in the top 5, but if you look, I double-digit on most of it. I didn't have the slip in the mud like most people did at tight end. And Dobbs being just a point or 2 under his differential didn't really kill me. Now, Seattle, I kind of thought would do a bit better against Denver. That was a little bit of a bummer, but I also have some positivity on my bench. The Dobb mob would have put me, he was a running back 3, so that's pretty pumped, or I'm pretty pumped about that. And Daniels would have been the quarterback 5 had I played them, so I actually left a fair bit on the table myself. So let's not assume that every week the top 2 players are going to play each other, but this was a pretty epic way to start. And I'm sorry, Connor, let's just agree to not play each other for a while, because I don't want to have to deal with this again. I'm not sure if that is better or worse than this matchup, where Marco, you are our 3rd top scorer and our 2nd top winning scorer, but you weren't really sweating this one a whole lot. Now, I think especially this could have been a lot tighter if the CMC Music Factory would have stepped up, because that would have been a really interesting game. You had a couple people here, Maxon and Purdy and McCaffrey, that could have made this at least a little bit tighter, but let's be honest, it got off to a pretty horrible start. Now, you did have Lamar Jackson as our QB4, Enemy Montgomery was pretty good for you, but aside from that, just wet farts across the board. You do have some points on the bench, and you do know that people like London and Olave and Addison are not going to continue to have the weeks they had, especially someone like London. I got to think Atlanta, I mean, maybe their offense isn't as good as people thought, or maybe Pittsburgh's defense is legit. Only time will tell. I'd be a little worried about Olave just because all the love went somewhere else. And they were playing Carolina, so I don't know, but let's see how that works. Marco, for you, your wide receivers were phenomenal. Hill was our wide receiver 3. AJ was our wide receiver 5. I'd be pretty happy with my with Walker. Etienne did cough that ball up, so we'll see what that looks like. But again, you're someone that just kind of did enough in each spot. Laporta, like I said, if you can get more than 7 points from your tight end, you were on the better half of things. Chuba Hubbard was an interesting play, and unfortunately it didn't work out for you so much. Now, you did have a few few options on the bench and some things to play around with. Plus, you're not allergic to moves. So the fact that you slightly underperformed, but pretty much just hit your predicted in a week like this, that was definitely good enough to win, but definitely good enough also to be our second highest winner. So congrats. Timmer, you had an interesting week yourself. Your Chiefs stepped up, so that must have been a fun Thursday night game to watch. Rice definitely overstepping for you, and actually your receivers in general were definitely a strength. Waddle overperformed, and then freaking Mike Evans. We don't take him. He doesn't seem sexy, and then he just catches for 1,000 yards. Now, granted, let's not anoint him king of the world quite yet. He was against Washington, so we'll see how that goes. And you do have some injury concerns in Puka Nacua. Looks like he's going to be out for a few weeks. However, take a look. You already have people to replace him. Jay Will would have been the wide receiver 4, and Stevenson was the running back 5. So you definitely have some talent on the bench and some people to play around with. So you're looking pretty good moving forward. Rennie kind of sucks because you definitely had a great performance out of Godwin. Even Jefferson at least did enough. And you know someone like Mahomes is going to score a bit more against other teams that aren't the Baltimore Ravens. But just ultimately, you didn't have enough people step up. You had a few underperformances. I think you were hoping for a bit more for people like Swift and certainly San Francisco's defense. Sorry, we'll go back to the bench. You do have some bright spots here. Now, you mentioned possibly dropping Ladd McConkey. I don't know if you've done that already or not. I thought you had mentioned something in the chat group, but he looks like a bright light. And Herbert, they did throw the ball a little bit more, so we'll see how that kind of moves going forward. Again, you're not allergic to moves yourself, and you still squeaked out enough that it was going to be competitive if you played someone else, but I know you're already due for a better week too. Gene, another week, another win just seems to be rolling off the tongue. If we go all the way back to last year, you're on a bit of a run here. Now, granted, Brian Thomas, I'd be pretty pumped about him. Bijan, I'd be pretty happy. In general, he didn't actually go crazy, but at least the workload he's getting. But you rose and fell with Saquon Barkley. That was a massive pick. He was our running back 1, so well done there. You have to feeling pretty good about that. You also did have some love on the bench, not actual love, but Baker Mayfield was sharing the love to many wide receivers. He was our quarterback 3 and some double digits there, so you do have some people to play around with moving forward. Kent A-Rich was our QB 2. That was great. Dallas was our only defense. I mean, it was the 3rd overall defense, but the only defense that anyone started in the top 5. That was great too. Unfortunately for you, and Brock Bowers, I mentioned weak tight end week, so 11 points, 11.8. That was our 3rd overall and our best that someone had on their roster. That has been rectified, but we'll see how that moves going forward. But ultimately, your Bears really let you down there, pal. Sorry about that. I mean, Williams did not have a great start, under 100 yards passing and only 15 yards rushing, so not awesome. And actually, had you taken the Bears defense, they were the top scoring defense this week. And you must know that because the Bears won and didn't score an offensive touchdown. So I wouldn't panic too much. I mean, your wide receivers are way more talented than that. You know, CeeDee Lamb's not going to be held to those kinds of numbers each week. So you definitely have a lot to play with, but kind of a bummer of a first week. And then, Gene, like I said, for you, another week, another win. Jeff, I imagine before the Monday Nighter, there were several times you looked at your roster and were just not thinking optimistic things, not thinking you're going to squeak this one out. Now, you did have Diggs, who in that crowded wide receiver crew came out and had an awesome performance. Got to be happy with Connor as well. And then obviously in the Monday Nighter, 2 out of the 3 guys that were in it stood up for you and put enough points up, and that was just enough to get you through. You do have some mobility on the bench here, some guys who scored, but you know there's going to be weeks where Harrison is not going to be held to this volume, that some of your guys are definitely going to have bigger weeks, and Baltimore's defense shouldn't be going against a great offense like that every week, so I don't think you're panicking too much. Plus, you just choked up, you muscled one out, you got the win. Congrats. Woody, on the other end of that, you are our second lowest scorer of the week. You kind of fell flat on your face on this one. Nobody reached the top 5. You did have somebody worthy on the bench to get in there, but he wouldn't have cracked the top 5, but he certainly would have helped you out a little bit. I don't think quite enough. But again, I don't think you're hitting the panic button too much. I mean, Gibbs did fine. Cook did fine. McBride will do better. You know Wilson. I mean, he was one of the 3 that Rodgers actually threw the ball to, so he'll probably still be fine. And there's no way St. Brown gets held to this kind of productivity on a weekly basis. He's going to have big weeks for you. So You'll make a bunch of moves because you make a bunch of moves, but I don't think you need to hit the panic button quite yet. But even just taking a look at your bench here, Woody, you just got to get your Chubb back. I'm going to keep making these jokes every week, by the way. They're not going to get old to me. Looking at next week's matchups, I don't know how they do it, but Yahoo always seems to manage to kind of pile the 1-0s against each other and the 0-1s against each other. So I guess we're going to have some 2-0. We're going to have some 0-2. And then between Maxon and I, we had our top and our worst score from last week. And yet somehow the prediction was within 5 points. So this is going to be a nuts week, right? But we already look at here, I think our 3-5. So Jeff and Tim, you're predicted within decimal points. This one's a bit more of a gap here, but we know Marco and Gene, you can't really hold anything out of Gene's realm of possibilities. We've got another one here within 4 points, another one here within 3, and like I said, Maxon and I are within the 5. So by the looks of things, Yahoo is predicting a quite tight race here, although, of course, it all depends on whether or not our quarterbacks wake up and decide that they can throw the ball more than 200 yards next week, because that would be helpful for offensive scores. We'll see. We only had one or two, actually 2 of us that went over our predicted, one that essentially hit it, and the rest, no bueno. So let's see what week 2 brings. Week 1's now in the books. I see week 2 obviously very healthily already started with some active waiver wire moves and people making some ad drops. We do have a few injuries to cover and a few preferences to kind of sort themselves out. So we're looking pretty good. It is not a pretty funky one, though. I mean, we do have the Buffalo-Miami matchup that should be coming just after I hopefully post this to everybody. Hopefully we're paying attention to that because obviously that's got a lot of impact in our league. But it's a tighty-whitey missionary week. We don't have any kind of funky international games or anything crazy going on. The old standard Sundays and the one on the Monday night. But if you look at the scores like I just went over, the predicted scores for week 2, it looks like we're in for a heck of one. That's going to be tight matchups all around. So best of luck, guys, in week 2.